So we now begin today's daf, Tzadiches, Ika de Nafkala Mihacha ve'Ika de Nafkala Mihacha. There are those Tanoim quoted in a brisa that we saw before that derive the conclusion that Shalmei Tzibur can only be eaten by Zichrei Kuna from the pasuk in Bamidbar Yudches. But Shmuel is citing Rabbi Eliezer. He derives this halacha from the juxtaposition of mincha to other karbanos in Vayikra Zayin. Chatos. Now we get to the third on the list of these various categories, the 6 categories of karbanos. Why does the Torah tell me chatos? What is chatos? How is it shedding a light on other categories? Chatos miskadeshes bibalua afkol miskadeshes bibalua. So this is exactly the case that we were addressing earlier. How do we know that just like in a case of a taroves of other karbanos, like for example kodshim kalim together with chatos, and they were all cooked together in the same pot, then the kodshim kalim take upon all the chumras of the kodshim of chatos, and that's written in the parsha of Chatz Kol Shatigabo Yikdash. How do we know that everything else besides chatos, other karbanos, also makadesh bibalua? And that would apply even to a case of chulin that was cooked with kodshim. So the answer is that the Torah went ahead and specified chatos in order to teach me that chatos is a binyanav from which I derive all other karbanos. Asham. Why did the Torah have to tell me asham? What's unique about asham that sheds a light on all other kodshim? Ma asham ein shafir v'shilya kadosh bo. So we know that a shilya is called the amniotic sac, whereas the shafir is the fetus inside. And if, let's say, you shech the carbon asham and you find inside a fetus, right, which is called a shafir, or alternatively, there's the amniotic sac, that's not kadosh. That's not included in the hegdesh of asham in the kedushas karban. Is af kol. In all other karbanos, the same halach applies that we exclude the shafir v'shilya ein kadosh bo. However, the Gemara says that this drasha is based on the assumption of Rabbi Eliezer, because Savar we hold that vlados kodshim b'avayosam yei kedoshim, that the vlad of a hegdesh karban, meaning kedushas aguf, is only kadosh with its emergence, its birth into this world. Now, we have to add another principle here that underlies this drasha, v'danin efshar mi efshar. When we talk about a shafir and a shilya of a karban asham, it's a physical impossibility that such a thing could exist, because an asham could only be brought from a male, and a male doesn't have a shafir or a shilya. But we're going to derive other karbanos from mincha based on the principle of danin efshar mi efshar. That even when the Torah gives you halacha, which it has to be such in the reality of the situation, nevertheless we could derive other cases which are subject in reality to such a thing. So we could not compare other karbanos to the asham regard to the status of the shafir v'shilya, since it's impossible for an asham, which is a male animal, to have a fetus, etc. But evidently, Rabbi Eliezer, who does derive that conclusion about shafir v'shilya, he holds that danim lo efshar mi, that danim efshar mi efshar. Now we go down the line. Why did the Torah have to tell me about the karbanos of the inauguration of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan? Mami luim mosro sehen b'sreifa v'ein balichayim b'mosro sehem af kol mosro sehem b'sreifa v'ein balichayim b'mosro sehem. Okay, we're going to talk now about Mosar in the case of Miluim and in the cases of other karbanos. Now, the literal translation in the English of Mosar is residual offerings. What does it mean, Mosar Karbonos? So there are two types of Mosar Karbonos. Let's say, for example, a person is magdish two behemos, one to be offered, and the other, in event that he loses the first one, he'll have a replacement. It's like sort of like the pitcher in the bullpen. Now, he was makriv one of them. The remaining animal, whether it's the second or the first, it's irrelevant. That has a din of mosar. And it's a living carbon, it's a living animal. So if a person was magdish a carbon and then he lost the carbon and then he found the carbon after he already set aside a replacement carbon, the one that has not been sacrificed on the Mizbeach is called Mosar. However, there's another kind of meaning to the word Mosar, and that is Nosar. So Mosar means Nosar here, which means if the carbon was not eaten within the framework of its allotted time period, then the carbon becomes Nosar. And the Torah commands us that Nosar ba'esh tisrof, you have to burn the Nosar. The Torah doesn't say anything about Mosar of a living animal when you had two korbanos that you were mafresh, and you brought one of them, and you might think that that Mosar should be burnt. It has the same din as Nosar, very strange Havamina. So the Torah tells me that that although Mosroseya, meaning in Nosar, is Bisreifa, but not Balechayim b'Mosar, even though Balechayim, in the case where you had set aside two korbanos, is also called Mosar, but nevertheless that doesn't require Sreifa. Shlomim, why does the Torah specify Shlomim? What is that meant to teach us about other korbanos? Ma Shlomim mefaglim mispaglim, af kol mispaglim miskablim. Parsha of Pigul, if you may remember from a couple of months ago in Zevachim, is written in the Parsha of Shlomim. So Shlom becomes the paradigmic case of Pigul. And Pigul means that it's mefagel, right? If you had a machsheves pigul, and also mispagel, it also itself becomes pigul, and that's true for all karbonos, which we derive from shlomim. However, the Gemara now takes a little bit of a digression here to mention a drush of Rabbi Akiva with regard to mincha. And originally, can I help you look for something? Originally, what we derive, I don't think I put it here unless you did. We said that mincha was the paradigmic case to teach us that the kodshim in the case of shari mincha have to be eaten by zichrei kahuna. But now Rabbi Akiva, the Masis Tanam V'Shem, Rabbi Akiva mincha. What does mincha teach me? Ma mincha miskadeshes bibalua, af kol miskadeshes bibalua. Now we learned from chatos, if you recall, that if you cook a chatos with something else, that something else absorbs the tam of the chatos and takes on the dinim of the chatos. Now we're deriving from mincha for some reason the same exact halacha that if the korban mincha was mixed together with something else, that something else derives the flavor and the dinim of the mincha. Frekti gemara ve'itzrich l'michtav mincha v'itzrich l'mincha chatos. Why do I have to derive the same identical conclusion from both mincha and chatos? And the Gemara answers, again, very strange answer, but let's try it. The yashmina mincha, if we only had mincha, the ID the rechicha mivla. Maybe this concept of absorbing the taste really is a reflection of a mitzius, of just a reality. Let's take a reality check. When you have something soft and you cook it with something else, then that something else will absorb it. And mincha is called rachich. It's something that's soft. It's like mostly, flour and it's soft. But chatos is made of basar. Basar is usually very tough. And emalai might think it doesn't absorb or give off a taste to something else. Okay, fine. As I state, I can't say anything here, but the Gemara is saying that, you need something soft in the Havamina. Oh, v'yashmin and chatos. Now, chatos is tough. if there's an absorption in the case of chatos, then how much more so in the case of mincha, which is soft, mishum de karir. But a chatos has another kind of an element, and that is that the time that it gives off penetrates, it goes in. Aval mincha emalo, mincha is more porous, and it doesn't really give off a taste that would penetrate. And I would have thought that the halacha of blia would not apply where if you had, let's say, a carbon mincha that was, let's say, cooked together with a wafer, a permitted wafer, I mean, a wafer of chulin, and therefore it's going to absorb, let's say, the oil of the mincha. Since the permitted wafer is porous, the absorbed matter does not penetrate deeply and would not combine and set up this principle of belia tzricha. Therefore, I need both chatos. And now we go back to the case of chatos. Ma chatos ein ba elamin achulin, right? You can't be mafresh a chatos from another behemoth kodshim. It's got to be from behemoth chulin. Ubayom, the chatos has to be offered during the daylight hours. Ubiyodo ayaminis, and the avoda, the carbon, is done by the kohen with his right hand. Af kol. This is true for the balance of the other five categories mentioned of karbanos. Eina ba elamin achulin bayom ubiyodo yamanis. Frek Gemara and v'chatos minolan. How do you know that these requirements apply to chatos? Amar Rav Chizda, the pasuk says, Amar kra v'hikriv Aaron espar hachatos asher lo. And what does it mean asher lo? It means mishalo v'lo mishal tzibur. In other words, it's got to come from his own pocket for his special par chatos of the Kohen Gadol. V'lo mishel maser. It can't come from maser sheni money because we're holding now that maser sheni money is not privately owned. So basically, we're taking this pasuk in Vayikra and we're deriving asher lo, that the Kohen Gadol has to buy this carbon from his own funds and not with any public funds or Maser Sheni money. And even though Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and he holds a Maser Sheni Mammon Hedjot, it's privately owned, but nevertheless, it's not considered the property of heaven. Bayom, we learn from Chatos that all karbanos have to be brought during the day. So the Gemara asks the following question: Mi biyom tzavoso nafka. Meaning, how do we know that in Chatos you have to bring the Chatos during the day? It says biyom tzavoso. So let's read the whole pasuk here in Vayikra Zion. It says, Asher tziva Hashem es Moshe b'Har Sinai biyom tzavoso es b'nei Yisrael akvas karbonim l'Hashem b'midbar Sinai. And this is going to teach us that Chatos requires Yom, and from the Yom in Chatos, we're going to derive all the other karbonos they require. So the Gemara says, now wait a second. The pasuk b'Yom Tzavaso that we just quoted in Vayikra Zion is not referring specifically to Chatos. So therefore, why do you have to tell me that we derive the halacha of Yom, the requirement of daylight hours, for the hakrava of all karbonos from Chatos, when the Torah itself says b'Yom Tzavaso with regard to other karbonos? And the Gemara answers Kedi Nazba. The Brisa didn't mention this for any particular necessary reason, but it threw it in also. Since we're deriving X, Y, and Z from Chatos, so we'll add Yom. Or B'Yodo HaYemanis. The Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Chonon, I don't need to learn Yodo HaYemanis from Chatos. The Omer Rabbi Bar Chonon Rabbi Shimon Kol Mokum Shenemer Etzba Ukahuna Eina El Yamin. So we could derive the requirement of Yamin from this pasuk of Etzba Ukahuna, and there's no need to derive it from Chatos. And the Gemara says again, Kedi Nazba. It's added there, just by the by. Ibai same as Savrla Reb Shimon di Omer Etzba lo boy Kahuna boy Etzba. So where the Torah specifies Etzba, the finger of the Kohen, then there's no need to mention kahuna. Kahuna is the word that indicates the right hand of the Kohen. But kahuna by etzba, when the Torah doesn't mention etzba, but it only mentions kahuna, there we're going to say the exact opposite. That etzba lo boy kahuna, when the Torah mentions the finger, right? It doesn't need to mention that the Kohen requires his right hand. Etzba, by definition, is the right hand etzba. But when it says only the word kahuna, then the Torah has to mention specifically the word etzba to teach me that it has to be done with the right hand. So etzba indicates the right hand, not kahuna. Asham, why did the Torah have to specify Asham? Ma Asham atzmosov mutarim, af kol atzmosov mutarim. That's even though the bus of the carbon has all the din of kodshim, but the etzem is not included in the Torah's kodshim. And this is going to apply even in the case of the atzamos of a carbon ola. I mean, the logic that applies to other carbonos does not necessarily apply to ola. Because with regard to other carbonos, the basar of the carbon is eaten by the Kohen. So you might say, well, what's the status of the atzamos? And we're going to exclude the atzamos. But in the case of the bones of a carbonola, where the ola is kulo kolo, it's all burnt on them, is consumed on them as beach. So you don't want to differentiate between the atzamos and anything else called mashmalon. That's what the word asham is teaching me, that just like asham, there's no Isur with regard to the atzamos, and he could benefit from the atzamos. So too, with regard to a carbon ola, he can benefit from the ola, from the atzamos of the ola. Omar Rava. Now we get back to dam chatos. You remember that if the dam of the chatos smatters on a beged, you need kibus, but that's only a carbon chatos, not the dam of a carbon ola. So therefore, Rava says pshitali, and here we're going to turn to daf tzadi chesam in beis, that dam chatos lamata v'dam ola lamala ta'un kibus. If the first dam that smattered onto and stained this garment, the first level directly on the garment was chatos, then even if the dam of an ola would now splatter on top of that stain, it's irrelevant. You still need kibus because the absorption of the garment was the dam of a chatos. However, Rava is the opposite scenario. Dam ola lamata, the first splattering that covered the surface of that stain in the garment was that of an ola, which doesn't require kibus. But dam chatos lamala, on top of that stain, the dam of the chatos fell. Mao, what's the law? Mishum no geahu. Should we say that the very fact that the dam chatos is somehow touching the garment, that's enough? V'ha no gea. And therefore that generates a chi of kibus. Oh, Dilma, no. Bishum baluahu. It's not enough that it touches the surface of the garment. It has to be absorbed in the garment. And now the garment has already absorbed the dam of the ola. There's no room for absorbing the dam of the chatos. Hadar pashte the ein ton kibus. In such a case where the dam ola came first, and there's no bilua of the dam chatos, therefore it doesn't require kibus. Omar Rava pshitali dam al bigdo chotzeitz. Now we're getting into the laws of chatzitza with regard to tvila in a mikvah of a tameh. Now, whether or not the stain on a garment, if the garment contracts tuma, now you want to put the garment into the mikvah, whether that stain is a chatzitza, it all depends upon whether you're makbid, whether you're very interested in getting rid of the stain, which for you and I for sure would be so. However, in tabachu, if he's constantly, as a butcher is, involved with dam that's splattering all over his garment, he doesn't care so much about a little dam on a stain, is eino chotzetz, then he could, the tabach, who's the owner of this garment, is allowed to be mitayer the garment if it contracts tuma in the mikvah, and the dam is not a chatzitza. Revav al bigdo, if let's say he has filth or literally grease that got smattered onto his garment, then chotzitz, it's a chatzitza that separates the water of the mikveh from the garment itself. But in mocher, rachavu, there are those who deal with fats and lards and grease, and that's how they make a living, and they constantly have it splattered on their garments. Einu chotzi is not makbid. However, boy Rava, here Rava finds a complicated case. Dam uravav al bigdo mahu. So what's the case? He's got both dam and grease on his garment. Im tabachu, if he's a butcher, so he has no paid about the dam, but typically mishum ravav. There's a chatzitza because of the grease. V'im mocher ravavu typically mishum dam. Even if he sells grease, that's his business, but nevertheless he's makbid on dam. Lo tzricha, what was the suffix of Rava? The Ovid Hava Ha. He's he is a man of many trades. He's a butcher and he's also a grease seller. Achadalo kapid, maybe each one, whether it be dam alone or whether it be grease alone, ravav alone, is he would not be makbid. But now Atarte kapid, even he has standards. So if he's got both grease and dam, that's already a big headache, many stains on his garment, then he's makbid on. He wants to get rid of it. O dilma tarti nami lo kapid, teku hadron alecha perik damcha. So let's just begin the Mishnah of the next perek. Okay. Now, what cases do we have in Kodshim where the basar is given to the Kohanim and they could share it with others? And who are these people that they could share the basar with? The people that they share the basar with are people who at the time of the Hakrava could eat the basar. However, a Tful Yom who went to the mikveh today, but he can only eat kodshim after nightfall. So today, during the day when the carbon was brought, he was excluded from eating the basar. Or mechusar kapara, which means zav, zova, yoletis, and mitzorah, that haven't yet brought their carbon, so they can't eat kodshim. Einam cholkim b'kodshim lechol erev, even though that very following night they will be allowed to eat kodshim. Let's say in case it's full yom, he needs hariv shemesh, and now it's nightfall, but nevertheless, he cannot get part of this carbon because at the time of that krava, he was not roy lachila v'eno makriv. I'm sorry. Onain, what's the status of an onain who lost one of his close relatives, but it's before the burial? He can't do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. Is nogea Vieno Makriv. He doesn't have the status of a Tomei, so he can come in contact and touch Kodshim, but he cannot be Makriv unless he's the Kohen Gadol. Vieno Cholek Lechol Erev. And once again, even though in the nighttime they'll already in the meantime bury the dead, so he's no longer an Onan, he could eat Kodshim, but nevertheless, since during the day he could not eat Kodshim, he was excluded by virtue of the fact that he is an Onan, therefore he can't eat Kodshim even at night, because everything is set in motion at the time of that krov. Bali mumim, in a case of a Kohen is a Bal Mum, although he can't do the avoda, but he can eat the basar kodshim, bein Bali mumim ovrim, bein Bali mumim kvuim, and it matters not whether or not it's a balmum that will eventually pass with the passage of time, or it's a permanent mum, a blemish that will not go away. We could give them part of the carbon of the basar, and they could eat the basar. Avalon makrivim, the Torah only excludes them from the hakrav of the avoda, but not from the achila of kodshim. So the general rule is the following: Kol she'eino roy la'avoda. If at the time that the avoda was done, he was not roy, is eino cholik b'basar, he cannot get part of the kodshim, of the basar kodesh. Kol she'ein lo b'basar, since he doesn't have a share in the basar of the carbon, then therefore he's excluded ein lo ba'oros, he doesn't get the hides as well. So generally speaking, there's a schus of the Kohen who does the avoda to eat the basar and also to receive the hides of the carbon, as it says in the parish of Olav HaKohen Makriv es olas ish or ha'ola sher hikriv lakohen lo yeh. And since it says asher hikriv HaKohen, that tells me that we're talking about a Kohen who's royal avoda at the time that the Ola was brought as a carbon. Now he writes here in the note that the apportionment of the of the hides differed from that of the basar, in that the basar was apportioned each day to the Kohanim of the Beis Av, of the family of that Kohen who serves on that day. Or, on the other hand, was apportioned every Friday to all Kohanim of the Mishmar. All right, we go on and finish this part of the Mishnah. Afilu tame b'shas rikas dam v'tor b'shas hekter chalovim eno cholik b'basa. Even in the case where a person was tame at the time of the zrikas hadam, and by the time they got to the haktoras chalovim vaimurim, the burning of the fats, which is at the end of the avoda, that's what they do. He can no longer, he doesn't have rights to eat from the basa because he was excluded at the time of the shasrika, meaning he was not roy liavoda at the time of the avoda. Shenemar, as it says, hamakriv es dam hashlamim v'es hachelev mibnei Aaron lo sia shok hayamin lemona. Now, the Torah uses the term hamakriv. Hamakriv means that he who is roy lakrova. And the Torah is teaching us that the rights in the case of shlomim to get the shok hayamin, which is divided up amongst the kohanim, that's only kohanim who are eligible to perform the avoda. And then the Torah mentions hamakriv as dama shlomim to convey that in order to qualify for a share, a kohen must be eligible when the blood is thrown, meaning b'shas avodas zrikas hadam. And this leads us to the Gemara on Daf Sadi Tes, which Mitzvah Hashem we'll learn on our own. You'll learn on your own, and I'll learn on I. I'm not accepting it as a neder, but beli neder. Okay then, so Mitzvah Hashem lehitraot biyom revi'i.